Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Karen Litfin, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington. Litfin approaches her teaching and research through a person-planet perspective. She encourages her students to explore questions of human meaning and values in relation to global environmental politics. Her latest book is Ecovillages, Lessons for a Sustainable Community. On January 13th, 2014, Litfin participated in a panel discussion titled Ecovillages and Eco-Districts, Solutions for Climate Changes as a guest of the Oregon Leadership in Sustainability program. Thanks, Karen, for coming on to speak with us today. Tell us first why it's important, in your view, to take this person-planet perspective in your work.
Yeah, we're living in an interesting time. We, according to scientists, have just entered a new geological era, the Anthropocene, the era in which humanity is the dominant force on the planet. So I think it's really incumbent upon each of us to ask the question, what does it mean to be a human being alive at this point in history? And how does that impact us personally, and what is our personal responsibility? And I would say that's an especially important question for those of us who are living in the high consumption countries, which would include Americans. And it's not a question that need bring us into a state of enormous panic and guilt. It's a question really worth exploring, because I feel that we're living in a special moment in history, and it's both wonderful and sometimes a little worrisome what will become of our species, and each of us has something to offer in that regard.
So tell me what an eco-village is.
Well, actually, anybody can call themselves an eco-village. I suppose it's any group of people who are trying to live more ecologically. There is a global eco-village network, an international organization that has thousands of communities that are members of it, and they have online a community assessment tool through which any group of people can decide how well they're doing in terms of ecological, economic, social, and cultural sustainability.
So what inspired the eco-village movement? How did it come about?
The movement actually didn't start as a movement at all. It started with individual communities, even going back to the 60s. Even there's a couple of communities pre-war who recognized that humanity's consumption patterns were on a collision course with the earth and started living more sustainably. However, in the 90s, they began finding one another through the internet, and a global eco-village network, this organization, was born. So many communities who had no idea that one another even existed found one another, and they found out that they were doing many of the same things. For instance, beekeeping is pretty much universal in eco-villages. Rainwater, recycling, well, all sorts of ecological practices, natural building, solar panels. And there were also important differences, and so they learned that they could learn from one another through their best practices and sharing.
So your recent book is structured around 4 themes: ecology, economy, community, and consciousness. I think you call it E2C2. Why are those concepts important in the way you approach the phenomenon of eco-villages? Where did that come from?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. In fact, the whole book is organized around those 4 windows into sustainability, I call them. Well, the obvious one is ecology. When we talk about sustainability, we're generally at least have that in mind. And economics is also about our material relationships, but it tends to be our material relationships with one another and the planet. So the economy is kind of how we manage our planetary household. In fact, ecology and economics come from the same root, ecos, which is the Greek word for household. So it's really a question of how are we doing with our now planetary household in a global economy. And community is our relationships with one another. And that goes, of course, at the micro level. How are we relating in our local community? But also, how are we relating as a global community? How do our ways of behaving affect those who may have no individual contact with us whatsoever. For instance, our emissions of greenhouse gases are affecting people all over the world. So that would be communities. This is social, the interhuman dimension. And consciousness is the piece that I think gets a little short shrift because we're so oriented as a society to the external world. The consciousness is more the internal world. It's the question that I ask in my person, planet, politics approach. It's a question of who are we? Who are we on the inside? What are the questions of meaning that we're asking ourselves? And how do we formulate different ways of thinking, different stories, you might say, of how, of what it is that we're up to? So I would say that cultures are telling themselves a story about who people are in relation to the world. And our culture tells ourselves, we tell ourselves the story, even if we're not aware of that story. And our particular story has a lot to do with acquisition and possession, and that's completely unsustainable. So I think part of what eco-villages are doing is that they are actually telling another story, and that becomes of great interest because what they're doing in many ways is working.
So tell us about the research that you did for Ecovillages. Where'd you go? What did you do?
Thank you. Well, first I want to say a little bit about why did I do such a thing.
Oh yeah, tell us that too.
Because I'm a professor of international relations. So you might wonder, why is somebody who's teaching about international diplomacy and treaties and this sort of thing traveling around the world to these little micro-societies? And it's really because after decades of writing and teaching and thinking about top-down solutions, I have decided that they, as important as they are, and my first book was on the ozone treaties, tremendously important treaties, because if we didn't have those treaties, we wouldn't be worried about climate change now. We would be worried about stratospheric ozone layer. So I began thinking, well, clearly this is not sufficient. These treaties are not sufficient. And there's an imaginable way of living whereby we would live within the carrying capacity of our planet. And I thought, who might be living that way? So I began doing this research. So I did research on eco-villages for a couple of years, and then I got very curious, and I wanted to see what are they actually doing out there, and is it really working, and are these people having any positive effect on the larger world, or are they just living their happy green lives? And so that's when I decided to go around the world. It took me a year to plan the journey.
How many did you visit?
Yeah, I visited 14. Well, I visited many actually, and there were 14 that were part of the official study, the study that I did the human subjects review for through the university. And in each of these communities, I lived for at least 2 weeks, in some cases much longer. I was on the road altogether for about a year, and I visited communities, 3 communities in the US, I think 5 in Europe, 1 in Africa, 2 in Asia, 1 in Japan, and 1 in Australia. I was looking for diversity. I was looking for diversity across the question of location, urban, rural, suburban. I was looking for diversity with respect to socioeconomic and cultural status, so rich and poor, and developing countries and affluent countries. And I was looking for diversity in terms of beliefs. Why are these people doing this? So I articulated those as religious, spiritual, and secular. So I was looking for diversity, but I was also looking for success. So I deliberately did not visit communities that were known to be failing because I wanted to see what worked. And then I asked myself the question, if you look across this great diversity and it turns out that there's some important commonality between, let's say, eco-villages in West Africa, an eco-village and an eco-village in Hollywood, then that suggests that there's something very powerful happening. Because if people are actually seeing the world in similar ways across this diversity, then we have something of what you might call a global consciousness developing. And so I, as interested as I am in eco-villages, I'm actually interested in this larger phenomenon.
So what were some of the common themes or commonalities that you found?
Yes. So one is that the web of life is sacred. And I would say that that's true even for the secular eco-villages. I'd explain why in the book. And that, most importantly, that we are an integral part of that web of life, that we are not separate, and that there are ways of living that make that so. Because the ways that we're living right now are as if we don't belong here. And frankly, I think there is a feeling among many people that we don't quite belong here. Mm. So starting with that premise, we belong here. Let's live that way. And that would be one commonality. Mm-hmm. Another commonality would be that the way you go about doing this is by creating bottom-up experiments, and that this would be where real social change will happen, the most far-reaching social change. So that does not mean that they're not interested in top-down solutions or that they are politically inactive, because I would say by and large eco-villages are more socially and politically active than the mainstream culture. And then finally, I would say another commonality is that it's more important to go towards what you want than against the thing you don't want. Hmm. And I think this is something that I've really taken to heart, because so much of politics is protest and resistance and trying to persuade other people to do the thing that you want to see done, mm-hmm. to vote the right way, etc. And I think some of this is important, but to actually go out and create the vibrant alternatives that can actually work for the long haul, now that's inspiring.
So what you say, the eco-villages that you visited were successful. Are there any challenges, particular challenges that they confront when they're living in this sustainable way?
Yeah, oh my goodness, yes. I don't want to be a cheerleader for eco-villages, and there are many problems. It is hard work. Mm-hmm. Diana Leaf Christian, who has written a couple books about communities, she says community is the longest, most expensive personal growth workshop you'll ever take. So it's hard. And you know, one of my questions, so I did interviews in these communities that I visited, so 14 communities and 10 interviews in each of those communities. Each of those interviews was between 2 and 3 hours long, so I got some information. Mm-hmm. I came home with so many interview notes, it was insane. The book represents maybe 1% of what I got. And you know, what I'll do in this interview would be maybe 0.5% of that. So, I'm sorry, what was your question?
The challenges.
The challenges. So I asked people in those interviews, what is the most challenging aspect of eco-village life for you? Mm-hmm. And almost universally they said human relationships. Mm-hmm. And then another question was, what is the most rewarding aspect of eco-village life? And most of them said social relationships. So it's hard, but it seems to be also rewarding. You learn a lot about yourself by seeing how you interact in sometimes difficult situations. So
generally these are not communities that are very atomized with, you know, somebody goes into their house and they basically stay in there. There's a kind of obligation to collaborate and work together as a larger group.
These are not communities of hermits, although I understand that those kinds of communities exist. They're very dynamic. Sometimes they even have a sharing economy. Mm-hmm. Very often they're growing food together. They are preparing food together. They have meals together. They are building their homes together sometimes. And so there's a lot of interaction. And then there's also simply the governance of the community. How do we make decisions together? Many communities in the affluent world, which I would call postmodern mm-hmm. eco-villages, mm-hmm. they operate by consensus. And when consensus works well, it's really beautiful because you get solutions that are far beyond what the majority could have come up with. Because maybe one person will put in a proposal and there's resistance to that, and so they amend the proposal, and then finally the solution that comes out is even better than you would have otherwise gotten. But if one or two people feel like blocking consensus, you can have a disaster. Frankly, I think that's part of the reason the Occupy movement, I wouldn't say failed, but sort of dissipated. And then, you know, I think there's simply just the fact of living in close proximity. And sometimes it's just that you don't want to talk to people and you've got people there all the time. Co-housing communities have a term for this called ratcheting, which is that somebody comes up to you and wants to talk to you while you're just trying to get your groceries into the house.
That happens outside of eco-communities too, I think. Are there economic challenges that are unique to eco-villages?
Yeah, I would say one economic question is, how much do we share? Do we share 100%? Do we share just the land and we have our own private homes? So all of that needs to be worked out. Excuse me. I've been talking a lot these days.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You know, one of the most interesting things to me about eco-villages is that, especially in the affluent world, these are people who are very often living on a small portion of the average per capita income of their host country. So, for instance, at Earth Haven in North Carolina, most people I spoke with were making under $10,000 a year, and they didn't seem poor. They didn't have a mortgage. They grew much of their own food. They had found businesses that involved labor trading, and they worked from home. They didn't have private cars. Many of them didn't have private cars. Most communities that I visited were doing some kind of car sharing. In Europe, one community that I visited in Germany, Siebenlinden, a very interesting community, really living on a one Earth footprint, or at least close to it. People there living maybe on 12,000 euros a year. So one of the things I was interested in is, how do people pull themselves out of the global economy, or at least to some extent? And also in doing so, how do they navigate technology? Because these are not primitive communities. Almost every community that I visited had Wi-Fi throughout, and that was several years ago. I imagine they pretty much all do now. And I met web designers who were working in little grass huts, and computer programmers living in tree houses. So that blending of technology is very interesting to me.
So how do state and local governments or national governments where these eco-villages are, how do they respond to these communities?
Well, it's interesting you ask that. In the beginning, especially the communities that got started in the 60s and 70s and even into the early 80s, they were considered pretty far out. And in fact, local people sometimes considered them to be cults, or in Europe the word is sects. And they got a lot of criticism, and sometimes even dangerous criticism from local people, not from government. Now, over time, what's been interesting is to see how the mainstream has come closer to eco-villages. And so now some of these communities that were called cults a couple decades ago are now educational centers for local elected officials, for instance.
Where, like, for example, where is
at
that?
Findhorn, for instance, the United Nations runs a number of centers for sharing best practices across multiple cities and rural areas as well. So Findhorn is the location for this UN Center for Training of Local Elected Officials in Sustainability Technologies. This is in northern Scotland. People come from all over the world. When I was there, there were delegations from Japan, China, and Korea going to Findhorn to study sustainability through the United Nations.
So how does this, how does the eco-village movement affect societal change within existing political and economic systems? I mean, capitalism, it seems to me, is antithetical to sustainability, right? Endless growth. So how can capitalist governments, when they come to learn, what do they learn? What are they going to be able to take away?
This is really, you're hitting the nail right on the head. So how can we possibly move to a sustainable society given the way things are? And you're right, the story that we're telling ourselves is a story of acquisition and unlimited growth. And it's an unviable story, and we're beginning to wake up to that. We're not going to simply jump into another kind of society. The way it's going to work, and the way I see it already working, and what I think eco-villages are up to, is we're leveraging the resources from our current society with a new intention, an intention to create a sustainable society. So that means, asking yourself difficult questions. Like a question might be from me, does it make sense to fly around the world in order to study sustainability? I feel that it did, because this book, well, let me just tell you what Joanna Macy says about this book. She says, if you can't take a year off to visit eco-villages around the world, this marvel of a book is the next best thing. It's actually even better for the carbon it saves, the questions it asks, and the wisdom it shares. So I hope that's the case. My intention was not to tell people that they should all travel around the world and visit eco-villages. And these are hard questions. If we're farming, should we use a tractor? Or should we just try to train horses and use draft horses? We really need to ask ourselves these questions. And if you are sincere in your purpose and you're leveraging today's resources in that direction, I think we have a shot at it. And eco-villages, this is a question they're asking themselves around a very different core purpose than the dominant culture.
So here we are in Eugene, Oregon. It's it's a town that's very friendly to ideals of sustainability. The University of Oregon has signed on to a sustainability plan. So I'm a professor at the University of Oregon. I live a regular first world life. I participate in the capitalist economy. So what are some things that I can do, just Joe average guy,
right?
To what can I take from the eco-village movement?
Yeah, it's interesting. The sharing economy is really catching on everywhere. And in eco-villages, the fact that you know one another and you build relationships of trust enables you to share much more. And what's interesting to me is to see the ways that technology now is facilitating that. So for instance, I'm getting around on my book tour right now through Airbnb. Interesting. And that's a form of collaborative consumption. And it's facilitated through the internet, and they have pretty good security checks from what I can see. And the person that I'm staying with here in Eugene, I found him on Airbnb. Well, he's an architect and who had just sent the announcement for my talk that I just came from with the Green Builders downtown. He had just sent that out to 300 architects that he knew. And I found him on Airbnb, and he's got this beautiful little yurt and a little lending library on the street. So these things are cropping up everywhere. Bicycling, even some of the spiritual practices that you find in eco-villages. For instance, every eco-village that I visited had some form of place for prayer or meditation and collective coming together in this way. You find this becoming mainstream as well. So, eco-villages they seem to be exceptional, but they're actually just a few steps ahead of the mainstream.
Well, I know that, New York City, I was just in Chicago, they now all have these bike sharing kiosks all along the streets.
Yeah.
New York and Chicago, these are not eco-villages in any conventional sense.
Yeah, eco-villages that I visited were all doing car sharing, but now we have Car2Go, which is fantastic. I don't know if you have Car2Go here, but
I can't remember what they call it, Zipcar.
But I think Car2Go is a little better. I shouldn't be advertising. But all of these practices are really catching on universally. And I think that the nice thing about eco-villages is that they're doing all of these practices in one place, so it can be more integrated. But I should say that you may have heard of the Transition Towns movement. The Transition Towns movement was started from a book that was written by Rob Hopkins called The Transition Handbook. And basically he had been living in an eco-village and realized that local people didn't understand what he was up to, and that doing that cultural education was very important. So for him, and I talk a little bit about him in the book because I was able to speak with him, he says that transition towns are basically the eco-village concept scaled up and without the trappings. No rituals, no new age stuff, no, none of that. Just, very simple how are we going to leverage our culture from here to there?
So when you say scaled up, for example, how? Scaled up how?
Oh, for instance, you go to government, for instance, to develop policies for sustainability. You get together as a municipality rather than as a community of 100 people or 50 people, whatever it is, and you make decisions together. You do urban food shed system. You do district heating on a neighborhood level. So basically doing eco-village principles, but doing them at the level of town or city.
So you mentioned when you read the blurb from the back of your book, and you just mentioned the importance of communicating this information. Tell us a little bit about the style, the writing style of your book. I mean, you're a tenured faculty member at a Research One university. So is this a typical book that such a person would produce?
No, no, because I came to the conclusion that sustainability is too important to be left to the academics. And part of what I was doing in this journey was to transform my own life. And I realized that as much as I had transformed my thinking, I had not transformed my mode of expression. So it actually took me 5 years to write this book. Partly because both of my parents died during that time, but that was not the main reason. The main reason, two main reasons. One is that I needed to learn how to write, and I think I did that. And the other one is that I got so inspired by all of this that I bought a farm and started a farming community. So I'm more living it now than I was before.
Just tell us, we have about 30 seconds left. Tell us, how big is this farming community?
We're
Where
small.
Is this farming community?
We're small. We're outside of Seattle, and we've only got about 8 people living with us now. It's small, but it's really something, and we love each other.
And it's working. I mean, it sounds like you're creating an eco-village. Yes.
Small, not an eco-village. Little eco community.
And it's succeeding.
Absolutely. So far, so good.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I really appreciate it. I've been speaking with Karen Litfin, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington. On January 13th, 2014, she participated in a panel discussion titled Ecovillages and Eco-Districts, Solutions for Climate Changes as a guest of the Oregon Leadership in Sustainability program. Thanks for watching.